It is a beautiful day to be alive. I am so happy that we have this time together. I'm Sanaa Laybourne. I am a professor, scholar, connector, and avid reader. I've always loved learning about what's happening in our social world and sharing that knowledge, especially over a good cup of coffee. And so here we are. Each week on Let's Grab Coffee, I catch up with experts from across the country who are investigating our most pressing social issues and common curiosities. Over the next hour, you'll learn about their inspirations, motivations, and of course, what they know about the world around us. So go ahead and grab that cup of coffee and get ready for an engaging and insightful conversation. In 1990, Congress passed the American with Disabilities Act, a federal civil rights law banning discrimination against people with disabilities in many areas of life. However, despite the ADA and more precisely the work of the disability rights movement in bringing public visibility to the injustices faced by disabled folks, the law doesn't cover accessibility or inclusion in every area of life, nor does it change ableist attitudes. And because ableism is ubiquitous in our social world, we must be active in challenging our own bias. In Against Technoableism, Rethinking Who Needs Improvement, Dr. Ashley Shew dispels some of the harmful assumptions about disability, accessibility, and technology. Dr. Ashley Shew is an associate professor in science, technology, and society at Virginia Tech, where she participates in the Science, Technology, and Society PhD program, the Medicine and Society minor, the Disability Studies minor, the Bioethics Graduate Certificate, and Integrative Graduate Education program on regenerative medicine. Her current research is about disabled expertise and disability-led narratives about technologies. She's working on an open educational resource on technology and disability with Hannah Hertigan, Damian Williams, and a team of undergraduate research assistants made possible through a National Science Foundation grant. Ashley's past work has been in philosophy of technology with particular interest in technological knowledge, animal studies, and emerging technologies. She is co-editor-in-chief of Techné, the Journal of the Society for Philosophy and Technology, and she is the sole author of Technological Knowledge and Animal Constructions and co-editor of 3 Philosophy of Technology volumes. Ashley is a grateful participant with her local disability advocacy and activist community in the Disability Alliance and Caucus at Virginia Tech and the New River Valley Disability Resource Center. Ashley joins us today. Hi, Ashley. So glad to have you here.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. I had to have you on when I saw this gorgeous book first. It is visually very beautiful with a cover, bright and colorful, that definitely caught my attention. But also just for me personally, I am trying to learn more about disability, about ableism, about bias, and hopefully, integrating what I've learned, particularly in the classroom, since I am a professor as well. And so I was delighted to see this book and to be able to read it. And of course, to have you here with us this morning.
Thank you so much. I have my iced coffee ready. I take the name seriously, and thank you for that lovely introduction as well. I'll image describe the book for your listeners,
Yes,
which is to
please.
say, because I love the cover. I am not an artist, and everything they sent me was better than anything I could do. So I highly recommend the art team at Norton. But it gives the title Against Technoableism, Rethinking Who Needs Improvement. It has my name, but it also has like a yellow background that's framed in green, and then like a whole bunch of brightly colored wingdings that represent like different disability icons and items. So there's like a wheelchair lifted van. There's some like eyes. There's some like cross out signs. There's like a band-aid on a person's like on a figure's head. There's some wheelchairs. There's prosthetic arms. There's prosthetic legs. There's just a whole bunch of pills scattered all around this, and a prescription pill bottle at the end. In one corner, there's like a cochlear ear implant symbol. There's glasses. There's hands that are like clapping. There's crutches. There's canes. So when I say brightly colored ring things, there's a lot of it. And at the very bottom, like in the middle, there's like an image of a prosthetic foot with a Tiva on it, and two googly eyes
Googly
glued
eyes.
to that foot. And that is my foot, which is to
Oh.
say I like to glue googly eyes to my body. But because it's super fun, because you can say it stares back when you get
Mm.
staring in public. So I just love what the art team did. So thank you.
Yes, they did an excellent job. And who doesn't love some googly eyes? Just
Love googly eyes. So
Yes. And I love this idea of it stares back, because something that, of course, you talk about a lot in the book is how people stare, right? This idea of noticing things that are quote unquote different, and a lot of intrusive conversations, or the ways people think they have a right to know your story or a right to know what's quote unquote wrong, and that you will tell them a story that they can understand and potentially be inspired by. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So there's sort of maybe two threads here, and one is sort of about staring, and how to manage staring if you're someone who appears differently in public. So sometimes we talk about apparent and non-apparent disabilities, and apparent like is to who.
Mhm.
So I'm in the disability community and I see someone with a Dexcom on their arm and I know they're diabetic, right? I know their disability. I see it. If I see someone like move their hands in a particular way in excitement, I might go, that person might have autism. Being in the disability community makes disability more apparent in particular
Mhm.
ways, because people with these sorts of set up situations. That might not be apparent to everybody else. But there is sort of, a lot of disabled people who have apparent disabilities that are apparent to lots of people, are people who have to manage staring on a daily basis, right? So people
Mhm.
will ask you questions about your body that they wouldn't normally ask other people. You can be asked questions while you are doing mundane tasks. You can be told you're inspirational just for like standing in a place for a little while. That's happened to me on multiple occasions because people see a prosthetic limb and they think, oh, this is inspirational. But I wasn't
Mhm.
actually doing anything. And if they had seen me walk, they would have seen like a really like crappy gait, which is fine. I'm comfortable with the gait that I have.
Mhm.
But that they were drawing inspiration from me just standing, like looking at a shelf.
Mhm.
That is misplaced. And it's a weird thing to always have to manage people's stares.
Mhm.
Some people outright reject it. Some people have funny stories they tell. Some people have tall tales that they will offer. I mean, the amputee community and the number of people who didn't really become an amputee through a shark bite, for instance, is actually very large. Um, but to constantly have to narrate something about our bodies is a particular type of intrusion,
Mhm.
right? Not like I don't walk up to people normally and go, "Hey, why do you walk the way that you do?" Right? Or why do you talk funny? Or what happened to your limb or your face or your spine in some cases, right? These sorts of
Mhm.
questions where people want to hear about a story, and some of the stories aren't that interesting,
Mhm.
right? And some of the stories, you're really every day of someone's life, you're asking them about the worst day of their lives,
Mhm.
right? If we're talking about people who lost things in or who became disfigured in really traumatic ways, to be asked that all the time is to be asked to relive a trauma. So these sorts of questions could be really invasive, and depending on how you arrived at being disabled, a lot of people, when they're asked this question, have to say, I've always been this way, right? There's not a story here. I have a
Mhm.
congenital disability. Is also like sometimes they feel like people are let down by that, like the sort of like social
Mhm.
interactions you end up in that are like supremely weird, are so common when you have a disability that's apparent to other people. But in some ways, that can make it easier too,
Mhm.
right? So when people see that I'm disabled, right, they'll know to give me a route that I can use,
Mhm.
maybe if they've thought a little bit about it. Um, and when I go into spaces, I'm not constantly asked to prove that I'm disabled, because my disability is so apparent. So it is, it's it is it's not neutral, but it
Mhm.
does affect every situation, in good
Mhm.
and bad ways. Yeah.
Yeah, you have a whole chapter where you're talking about some of these common narratives or stories that we might expect or even demand from disabled people in order to affirm really our own bias about the world, or really to make us feel good about whatever it is. And as I was reading through the book, what really stood out to me was, again, these demands on your story, on private personal information that we would never think to just walk, like you said, to just walk up to somebody and ask them really private, personal questions that quite frankly aren't our business to know, and that no one should be demanded or required to talk about in a particular way. And I saw a lot of those similarities in the demands for stories, in the way that transracial adoptees are seen visibly different, and that something is wrong often. And I am a transracial adoptee, so I was like, wow, like this, again, these public demands for private personal details, and the expectation that we will answer and in a particular way. And of course, for folks who've been listening to the show or familiar with some of the histories of family and family making in our country, we also know that adoption has been seen very negatively and stigmatized for a lot of our history. And so again, the past is always present in how we're observing people and what we expect from them. One thing that you talk about throughout the book, and of course is really the key to the book, it's in the title, is Against Technoableism. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about this idea of technoableism.
Oh yeah. So I mean, so people might have heard of ableism. And technoableism is, I would say, like a form of ableism, right? So
Mhm.
ableism is this broad category that suggests that certain ways of being in the world are better than others. So it's a system of, it's like social hierarchy. It's a system of value. It's a system of like who we prefer in jobs, in education, in every sphere of life, the sort of preferences that exist. And those preferences usually align with non-disabled. People
Mhm.
prefer people to be non-disabled. People prefer normality in a particular way. And so technoableism is this, but instantiated in sort of how we talk about our technological projects, particularly for disability. But even for new technologies, which I'll talk about in a second. There's so many engineering projects for disability are proclaimed as life changing for people.
Mhm.
Every new disability related technology is supposed to change people's lives. And let me tell you, our lives are not changed with all of those moments.
Mhm.
Sometimes the best changes are incremental, right? So everything is supposed to be life changing. It's good. People who work on disability technology are supposed to be saintly helpers who are doing something like radically important for the disability community. And often those teams don't include disabled people, and they don't get like the
Mhm.
story of our lives, right? They suggest that disabled is always a bad thing to be, and all of these technologies need to be there to correct for the
Mhm.
disability and not to just like make it easier for disabled people to adapt, right? I think those are two different ways of framing how we might do technological projects about disability. And I'm not a Luddite. I've mentioned wearing a prosthetic leg at this point. I have hearing aids. I have new ones ordered. I love headphones because I can just jack up the volume right now. So no problems in the Zoom setup. But there are so there are so many stories about technology and about disability that suggest that every disabled person is waiting for the next new thing to come save them. And if you're not
Mhm.
someone who has solutions for them already, that you're supposed to be existing in a hopeful state of like a pre-transition to being abled again.
Mhm.
And they talk about disability technology as particularly empowering to disabled people. So we're going to create this thing that normalizes disabled people in a particular way. And isn't that empowering? But it's not empowering if what you're being told is the way that you are is the wrong way to be,
Mm.
right? Those narratives also tell you like that praise technology and that require it, and that disabled people are supposed to internalize like the push for technology because somehow our lives are unworthy as they are. Like
Mm.
I'm not against technologies that help me with everyday daily tasks, right? I have a million
Yeah.
reminders on my phone as someone with chemo brain. I will not show up on time unless if things are programmed properly. But like at the same time, I'm not like lamenting my life that I need to like constantly check my phone to find out what time it is, right?
Mhm.
I'm existing. I'm using technology to help me exist, but it's not saving me. And it's
Yeah.
not empowering to like suggest that I need all of this technology to be a worthy participant in education, in jobs, in public places. So all of that, all of the sort of joyous like reporting like falls really flat if you're a disabled person who gets constantly messaged this way. And it makes all of these presumptions about what it is we should want in ways that don't necessarily align with the values of various disability communities, right? So rarely are these tech people saying, hey, does this particular technology fit in with the values of your community? No, by the time they bring in disabled people, things have been tested to a particular place and they want human subjects, participants, not advisors, not consultants, not makers. They consult us way too late in the process. So we get stories about technology, and of course we're all existing. I talk about ableism as the marinade that we're all hanging out in, like it's everywhere. So people get this message reaffirmed. And it's really hard to shake loose from and even identify technoableism in the world, because it's so part of our technological enterprise, even when we're saying things like chat GPT, right? So to talk about new and advanced technologies, and of course chat GPT was not rolled out when I drafted this manuscript. People talking about like how wonderful this will be, and when people suggest that maybe this is not the best thing in the world, people want to tell you, well, there's disabled uses for it, so we have to like it, right? And this is this is the story of like this is like greenwashing, but for disabled people, where, oh, well, if disabled users might want this gets done all the time for like automated cars too. Right. So what, don't you want blind people to be able to have the same mobility? I mean, yes, but you're asking for it in a particular like context of transportation, where I would love to see a lot more public transportation, and just having driverless vehicles doesn't do that. And the safety hazards with driverless vehicles are like more significant for the disabled population, right? If we're talking about people who don't move in crosswalks the way, people who have regular gaits move. Will I be recognized as a person becomes a question to me with driverless cars. So it gets hyped up as, oh my goodness, they're going to work with, some blind institutions to work on this tech. And, is this actually what the community wants? It needs to be a question a lot earlier. And it's offensive to always be used as someone's service project, right? That we might want technologies that are our own, but to sell them as some sort of humanitarian aid. I mean, I don't think anyone who's developing autonomous vehicle technology like actually cares about like disabled use. That's one use, but that's not why they're in it. Yeah. Sorry, that was a off-road to my thoughts on vehicles, which I don't actually talk about in the book.
I love to take a little off-road, so I'm all here for all of the off-roads that we can go on in this conversation. You said something that really stuck with me. You said it's not empowering to be told that the way you are, the way you're living is wrong or unworthy. And that's what all these messages that are so subtle, right? They just are baked into our society that we learn from growing up and then throughout adulthood. And we see emphasized, even as you mentioned, in all of these, grand announcements about all these tech advancements, right? They are confirming and reaffirming that there is a normal, quote unquote, normal, and therefore more desirable way to be. And that everyone should want to be, quote unquote, normal. And like what does that even mean? But yet we're subscribing to it. And if we're not aware of these ableist messages, then we'll just continue to think like, oh, this is the way that it should be, and everyone should, want this type of movement or whatever it is.
And this is where I really love like disabled narrative. And this is what I lean on a lot in the book. That there are wonderful books and poetry and blogs written by disabled people. Not all of us have access to like publishing and the bandwidth for it. But just wonderful stories that like very much counter this narrative. Like we talk about them, like Hannah Herdigan, who's one of my collaborators, we often talk about these as counter narratives, and this is something that she's done a whole bunch of work on. But like to talk about like the way disabled people are talking about these things is actually like confronting this, but it's not the message anyone's hearing. So even when we're doing our own storytelling, there's this one point in this book by Harriet McBride Johnson. The book is Accidents of Nature. It's about disabled kids at disabled summer camp. And one of the girls is flipping through a scrapbook and like commenting on it, and commenting like, wow, it looks like your parents made you waste a lot of time in physical therapy. Right, because there are like news clippings of the protagonist like standing up and walking with like a team around her, and it has like praise from her physical therapist about how hardworking she is as like an 8-year-old. And the thing is, they are both disabled kids at disabled summer camp talking now, and they're both wheelchair users. So they're saying, oh, you wasted a whole bunch of time. They wasted your time with that. And the one girl describes to the other her time in physical therapy, where they kept working because she had like a leg contracture, and they were working on it until it was suggested that she needed surgery to handle the leg contracture, but she doesn't walk. And she says, my parents realized that was fishy. And so now I just sleep with a pillow underneath my knee. I didn't need the surgery. I didn't need all that physical therapy. They were working on something that would be useful maybe if I walked, but I'm not gonna like that. Right. That's nothing that's ever been available to me. So there was all this time focused on normalizing with like the perception that you would be normal one day, or that you would be like some sort of ideal that wasn't ever going to exist. Right. So the sort of like therapy and she talks about therapy as being like really, really painful. Right. And that, that she had been spared because her parents wised up, and then she didn't have to get this surgery. And at the time she says the surgery, the girl whose scrapbook she's looking through like covers up the scars on her leg where she had gotten that surgery. Right. So these things that were forced through, because of course, and Bill Peace in his Bad Cripple blog talks about this as a ritualized ideal, that of course all disabled people want to walk again, right? That like, of course, like exoskeletons are the answer. But like, if you actually talk to like lots of wheelchair users, I mean, many people don't use them because like they're not using them for reasons of paralysis, right? So there are lots of wheelchair users who might have like fainting episodes or seizures, who sitting down is just better. An exoskeleton, that just means more seizures, or it means like your heart rate gets elevated in particular ways because your body isn't at rest. But in talking about this, I mean, he talks about this idea that the general public has, that all paralyzed people share this like ideal of walking. Right. And then we get these teams of engineers, these exoskeleton projects, where there's all these praise laid upon the engineers. But if you talk to people in like the community, they say things like, oh yeah, I'd really prefer that they do more research on bowel and bladder health. I'd love to have regular access to maintenance for my wheelchair, right? I mean, and they never talk about what exoskeleton maintenance will mean. Like when we know there are huge delays for wheelchair maintenance in this country, and that means people are often, if that's their only device, they are stuck in bed at home, like without the device. And it can be delays of weeks to months to repair a wheelchair now, right? Wow. And that's not even a fancy ass exoskeleton. So there's like all of these things that sort of the designers, the people who share and laud it and, hype it, like they can't even see that, the users would be much more interested in, and that the presumption that they should be normalized at all is a particular like sort of bias that's just so deeply entrenched. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, an exoskeleton, it sounds so flashy, right? Why wouldn't somebody want this? Whereas really making sure that we have structures in place for what disabled folks actually want is not as sexy, right?
Oh, and I was just thinking that like they want exoskeletons to be sexy, right? And the way they describe them, I mean, I love that any video you see of an exoskeleton like has music overlaid, and like they take out the sound of whatever, how much sound that suit is going to make for you, for the ones with different computerized devices and fans to cool off the computerized components, and like different hydraulics, like all of that is cut out. You just get like some jazzy music about like what the future is going to be like, maybe some techno in there. I mean, it really is presenting like a weird ideal about techno-optimism, right? That we like
Yeah.
it's a sales pitch.
It
But
absolutely.
no one see like it's seen as, oh, this is fun, good science. But no, this is also a sales pitch to you. And I also think like I don't actually think exoskeletons are like the worst. I think the way they've been like sold and discussed and seen as like a replacement for wheelchairs is probably incorrect.
Yeah.
I think like we will probably like their best use scenario is in physical therapy offices to help people who have had traumatic brain injuries and strokes,
Mm,
work on recovering different like muscle function, and work on movements that would be harder for them to do outside of an exoskeleton. So there's a use for it. I
hmm.
never see that in a press release. I never see that with music overlaid. I never see like a senior citizen walking around like with the team around them, in an exoskeleton. It's always like some young person,
Of course.
who's going to change their life. I had a class at one point. I just put up a picture of an exoskeleton on my slideshow.
Hmm.
And before like we could even get to discussing anything, one of the students was like, "How do you use the bathroom in that?" And then we all looked at the picture for a while. And the thing is, to use the exoskeleton, a person was going to have to take off the exoskeleton, get into their wheelchair, roll into the bathroom, transfer onto the seat, get back in their wheelchair, roll back to the exoskeleton and put the exoskeleton back on. Like that, I don't see. There was going to be no way to sit on a toilet in that exoskeleton, or get off your pants to use the restroom, right? There's just like some basic human functions, very basic human functions that like they were so focused on walking that
Mm,
actually like there's lots of things I can do in my day without walking.
yeah.
But in fact, something I know I'm going to have to do in my day, they it was not part of the design at all.
Oh, it's
um
like they didn't ask someone who might use an exoskeleton.
well, and they didn't
What?
ask what will you use this for, right? The idea is,
Right.
oh, you're going to want to walk, here's the walking device. And it's not that I'm anti that technology, but the use case is always so limited in how we see it.
Hmm.
And one that continues, I feel like, to make disabled life seem worse or off,
Hmm.
than it needs to be. Like once you look to
Hmm.
the exoskeleton as a fix, do you care about repairing sidewalks?
Yeah.
Right? Do you care about, and there's been lots written on this, as sort of replies to this ideal of we'll just get exoskeletons. We don't have to worry about infrastructure. But infrastructure like serves more people. Like curb cuts are
Ah.
for strollers and package delivery, not just disabled people.
Mhm.
And when you start to neglect all of this infrastructure, it impacts everybody too.
Yeah, absolutely. You say in the book, framing disability as the problem turns attention away from the real problem. The world is set up to exclude disabled people. And I mean, I think that's such the case, even as you're just talking about like curb cutouts, right? And just things like this that everyone could benefit from, but our world very much is only focused on a certain type of mobility, a certain type of person. But as you emphasize throughout the book, the longer we live, we're going to be disabled. Like all of us will likely have some sort of disability in our life, but yet we act as though we can just fix them all away, that there's a solution and that they should be fixed.
Yeah, and most disability research is about children or very old adults.
Mm,
They're like the dearth of research on people who are just living their disabled lives in the middle of their life, like really exists. And it's, when we think about solutions, like people who are disabled as children continue to live, right?
mhm,
This is not, it can impact you at any point. And I feel like it's a real denial of sort of human vulnerability,
mm.
fragility, that we live in like weird meat bodies, that get sick and leak fluids and, do all the things meat space does. Um, it's really, it's really a denial of our humanity and animality,
Mm,
to imagine things as we do, where we think that there's like a normal and that we want to be it, when there are lots of ways to be in the world that should be equally valid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There are lots of ways to be in the world that are equally valid. I love that. A friend of mine likes to say it's not less than, it's just different. And we often frame through that ableist lens that having a disability means less than, and we can, like you said, we can overcome it, and there'll be all these great stories of empowerment and inspiration. But it's just different. It's just a difference. But I think you really hit on something there when you said like this is just a denial of our humanity, our humanness, and particularly the denial that we are vulnerable, right? We aren't these superhero entities that can take over the world, but yet we are just humans, right? Trying to navigate this very human existence, with all of our weaknesses, that are inherent into being just a human being in this world.
Yeah. No, it's when people are so marinated in ableism, I think it also really makes it much harder to become disabled. So one of the things that I think about a lot is like, even as I was writing this book and I kept going, who is this for? Like, it's for everybody, but it's for everybody because I want to tell you about how to be disabled. Right. I want to make that transition easier. I'm lucky to have known about disability studies before I became disabled, and that's a rare experience. So what the transition meant for me was probably something really different than most people. It's not that it wasn't hard. I mean, I was going through like terrible chemotherapy treatments, and I was sick all the time, and I was tired all the time. And, I often say to people, like, being is easier than becoming. Right. Once you've made that transition, once you're adapting, once you've found, people will say the words like the new normal. I don't know that I like normal enough to want a new one. But to make things usual to you again. Right. I feel like there's a space of transition if you have a newly acquired disability that is completely confounding. And I mean, I even think for people who grew up with disabilities who weren't necessarily exposed to disability community, there can be that time too, where you're figuring out how to exist in the world, exist in a social world too, in ways that let you be yourself. I don't know that that makes a lot of sense, but it is one of like the motivating factors for me in writing and in teaching the way I do. I want there to be space and some orientation, so when people are becoming disabled or integrating into the community some way, they have some sort of bearings, right, about how to listen to other people in the community. Like, I don't just write about my disability types, it's multiple, but to actually like to build disabled coalition space, to plan futures together requires more than just one of us at a time. So I hope in some ways that this book is like a roadmap for some of those things, and it boils down to being human, but it also, I feel like we do a lot of denial of reality sometimes in these spaces. And I'm guilty of it too. I got an amputation, and you know what I got after I got an amputation? I got a temporary ADA placard. I got the one for 6 months. I was like, oh, and then
That's
I'll
it.
be fine. I have a permanent one now. I don't know why I went through extra paperwork. I'm not like unguilty of this problem and thinking things will be much better than they are. I now plan for a disabled future, not a non-disabled one. I was so used to planning for a non-disabled future that I assumed a level of function in the future 6 months after an amputation.
6 months. That was a quick turnaround in your mind.
You can pick 6 months or 5 years at the DMV. Okay. And I was like, listen, 6 months, then I'll be, and 6 months later, I was dragging around a very heavy prosthesis on forearm crutches with myself. Right. It was not, I was not healing in the way I should. And I think it's always really important to actually plan for a disabled future. That's where I end my last chapter, right? Like we have to
Yeah.
plan for disabled futures everywhere. But that's also a lesson I have had to learn in a personal way as well.
Yeah, I mean, I love this idea of this book as a roadmap, right? So folks who maybe who are disabled can see themselves reflected, but then also folks who aren't disabled yet um, can maybe have this to lean on at that point in time when they're like, "Wow, this is a shift in my identity," right? And that's what I was hearing as you were talking. We have this identity as an abled person who can, literally walk through life, and then we have to wrap our minds around like, okay, that's not who I am anymore, but who I am is it's just different. And now there's a different way that I interact, with the world, and the world is interacting with me. It's not less than. Um, but it could feel that way if you've bought into, again, like all of these ableist ideas of how you should be in this world and what it means to be able-bodied and the values that you've assigned to abled or disabled. So that can be, I could imagine that can be a very, very big challenge, but one that, all of us, again, as you talk about in the book, we're going to, as we get older, guess what? Our bodies are just not going to do the things that they are doing now or once did.
Yeah, no, and I think about this all the time with housing too. Um, one of my friends had their mom, and their mom who was in her 70s, moved into a 3-story narrow apartment situation.
Oh.
And we were all like, well, that's not that but this is very common. Like we build so many of our houses with like split levels,
Yeah.
and the need for stairs. The number of like front porches just without handrails, like every time I go for a drive, I'm just like, this is it would be hard for me to even get inside that house. And I'm pretty, I get around, in general well right now, as long as I'm not having a like flare up of hip pain. But, a handrail is going to be necessary on stairs. I don't know
Mm-hmm.
why we would build them otherwise. Like there's so many things just in the built space that just puzzle me. If we
Mm-hmm.
are indeed creatures who live in meat bodies, like we need to be planning in different ways. It is shocking to me, especially since we know we'll all age, the way in which people choose, when they can choose where to live, and just like the lack of accessible apartments, like a lot of these factors are, unreasonable,
Mm-hmm.
if we were planning in the ways we ought to for the bodies that we have.
Yeah, if we were planning in the way we ought to, with some level of reality about the
Well,
bodies
and
we
this
live in.
results in real danger. Like, who doesn't get evacuated during natural
Yeah.
disasters? Right? It's people whose, well, I mean, if we talk about fire, what immediately shuts down when there might
Yeah.
be a fire? It's the elevator. Do you have a
Mm-hmm.
way to get your disabled people out that's not stairs? Most people don't do emergency planning for disabled people. I think about this also with different, like people do, different drills for emergencies, and disabled people are told to like wait in the stairwell. That's our plan for the emergency, is like, disabled people wait in the stairwell till someone comes and saves you, but often no one's going to come save you.
Right.
This has been particularly like well recorded by Alice Wong at the Disability Visibility Project around the wildfires in California. But it's a conversation, that's present for every natural disaster, and sort of and unnatural disasters too, if we're talking about like different scenarios with gun violence and things like that. It's it's shocking. I read a lot of disability narratives, so I especially find it very hard. A theme I see again and again in literature written by people with congenital disabilities or who are disabled like early in their lives, is reading about the moment they realize that no one would save them in an emergency. Like they're doing some fire drill at school,
Mm.
and they're just told you're going to wait here, or like scenarios where they're actually like told as children,
Wow.
like this is the
Mm-hmm.
plan, but the plan is essentially that they won't be saved and everyone else will.
Mhm.
I find those parts of the different disability memoir that I read actually some of the hardest, like the message
Yeah.
that we're sending to kids with disabilities because of our lack of planning for them is sometimes like what that means to absorb that as a child. Like I know what ableism is like as an adult. I
Mhm.
read lots of stories from other people, but I don't think I can quite comprehend, that experience as a child. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, as you were talking, I was just thinking about that tension of, on one hand, this idea that we're going to save disabled people through technology and that you're going to be redeemed. But then on the other hand, having these real experiences of knowing that no one is going to save you, right? That you're existing simply to make people feel good about creating a technology and doing, bestowing some gift of walking or whatever ability on you. But at the heart of it, people feeling, like you're discardable, right? And so that goes
Yeah.
back to that idea of, being, hearing these messages about worth and value, that we're all exposed to and that we're all either integrating into our worldview or that we're actively challenging, and trying to draw attention to so that we can create different types of features and different types of communities.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's a huge tension there, right? We want to praise non-disabled people as helpers all the time, but the experience of disabled people know, like reflect in disabled community, we know that
Mhm.
help is about propping themselves up and feeling good in a particular way, where when it actually comes to thinking about like the larger context of our lives, they can't see it. Like I don't think these people like mean to be bad,
Right.
but the sort of like impact, if what you're experiencing the infrastructure looks so different than what this technologist might be telling you they want to do, or what usually a news story is telling you, is coming for you in an excited way. But I think there's also like market related things that we know. Like I
Mhm.
think it's really fun to play around in labs with different types of technology. Like I'm not against it there. I really like working with my friend Kara Chef Sari in construction engineering, and she has a whole bunch of little
Mhm.
bots. And we've had like disabled play groups down there to like talk about the technology together.
Mhm.
Um, and I think that's very different when she invites us to play, right, and to
Yeah.
talk to each other. That's a different model than when I'm constantly told something is going to make something so much better for me. And those messages aren't just like, I think it's easy to like just not turn to the text section of a newspaper. The
Mhm.
thing is, like, everyone else around you is also reading these stories,
Right.
right?
Mhm.
So I was becoming an amputee, and people started sending me like stories about prosthetics and about and they were trying to be really positive. It was,
Mhm.
I had cancer. It was a hard time in my life. Just the medical treatment for it and just being very afraid. And I would go through like several more amputations before I would go through the chemo I went through before.
Mhm.
Right. It was bad chemo.
Yeah.
And it was, so people like wanted to like encourage me by sharing these stories. And I don't like, I find them interesting as someone who works in science and technology studies. So that wasn't a problem. I found like, oh, let's look at the narratives. I'm probably reading them in a very different way. But
Mhm.
if I think about, what it is to be someone who probably won't be able to afford that technology or who doesn't have good
Right.
insurance. Other people around them are still telling them that they should be wanting that technology.
Mhm.
I have friends who have been out like in public. I have a friend who is a leg amputee and was using a wheelchair without his prosthetic limb. He had he has his other leg is also injured, but you can't see it.
Mhm.
And he's asked all the time, why don't you wear a prosthetic leg? Like, well, he has one. He
Mhm.
uses it sometimes, but if he's like shopping at the grocery store and he has to be on his feet for a long period of time, it hurts his other leg too much.
Yeah.
Right? Like, there's a reason he's not wearing his prosthetic limb, even though he has access to it, which not everyone does. Um, the sort of public like this, so someone would come and ask you why you don't have a limb. And, sometimes they suggest that you're inappropriate for not wearing your leg
Mm.
or your
Mhm.
arm. I hear this with arm amputees where wearing a limb makes people feel less sad for you.
Mm,
Like your encounters like can be about, oh, it's such cool tech, instead of, oh, I'm so sorry, how did you lose your arm? Right. And
right.
like, it was it your dominant arm? And like all of these questions. If you wear the prosthetic arm, then they want to tell you how cool the arm is. So it's a better interaction.
Mm-hmm.
But it is still one, like, you might not be using that prosthetic arm. That's for other people,
Yeah.
because of the constant situation. But even in terms of like manufacturing, like there are so many people who don't wear hearing aids.
Mm-hmm.
Insurance doesn't cover hearing aids.
Nope.
Hearing aids are expensive.
Mm-hmm.
So you're asking someone like to technologize their body, often for something that they might not be able to afford,
Yeah.
or might not want, right? So there's so much built into that, and because the messaging from media has filtered into our daily lives, and those of like, you can't get away from it.
Mm-hmm.
um and it's it makes it harder to just be disabled and in public. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You know what I really appreciated about your book was really that insight, because if you haven't had to navigate, right, trying to get fitted for a prosthetic or what that process is, or have someone maybe that you're close to that you've gone through that process with, you have no clue about the cost, about the process itself. I don't know, maybe people just think like, oh, you don't have a limb, so you're just going to go and get a new one. And just like automatically you're going to be, again, walking or using a prosthetic arm or whatever it is. So really understanding like what that process is, because I think for a lot of us, we may not be thinking about it, or even the fact that we expect people, like you said, to use technology and integrate it into their bodies. But it's really not accessible. People don't have access maybe to a doctor, so access to healthcare. And then if they do have access to a doctor, maybe not the doctor they need that has the experience they need, or again, here we go, money, because capitalism. And all of this is very expensive.
Yeah, I mean, so disabled people are often themselves painted as being more expensive. Yes, some of our tech is expensive, but when it comes to things like accommodations, I mean, surprisingly, like the large majority of workplace and school accommodations cost under $500 a year.
Mm,
Right. And if you're talking about someone who's like working full time, I mean, there are sometimes really simple switch outs. So, oh, you have migraines. Let's get you different color. Like, let's turn off these fluorescent lights,
yeah.
and get you better lighting. This is not a hard, and it's a one-time cost.
Hmm.
Most like things to better integrate disabled people actually are not as expensive as people think.
Hmm.
But there's this sort of social pressure to get these high-tech devices that they're going to solve the problem, and then we won't need accommodations, right? I think
Mm,
there's a certain like line of thought about accommodations as well here. So I use workplace accommodations. Lots of my students do too. They're
hmm.
using, I guess, student accommodations, which is a whole different office. Of course, it's really
Uh-huh.
hard for graduate students who also teach, because they have to go through, but they have to do the process twice, and it's completely different paperwork. Why wouldn't it be?
Of
Um,
course.
but to like, sometimes the accommodations are so small. Like it's like, oh,
Hmm.
I come in slightly later,
Yeah.
like, and I can leave early if I feel a migraine coming on, or if I feel not well, or if I'm
Hmm.
fatigued. Like, so a lot of them are about time and about how we
Hmm.
set up space. People who might need more time on a test, or a room with like less focus. The thing is, to get accommodations, even, we have to prove that we're disabled,
Yes.
and we have to go through these different offices. We have to give a doctor, like we have to give a doctor the paperwork to fill out. We have to have a doctor to fill out this paperwork. The doctor has to believe us too.
Hmm.
And then they might fill it out in ways that disclose too much information to our employer. For instance, the accommodations paperwork I had to fill out wanted me to list every medication I'm on. Do they need to know about the hormones I take because my ovaries no longer work thanks to chemotherapy? That's probably not relevant to my
Right.
workplace experience. Is me taking hormones, right? And it's in
Hmm.
the form of birth control pills, but that ship has long sailed, thanks to chemotherapy. Um, it is like degrading, right? So someone else gets
Mm-hmm.
to be the expert about you and passes it off to
Right.
someone who's an expert about how to accommodate you, when the disabled person themselves is living the experience and often not consulted.
Mm-hmm.
And if they're in the iterative loop, like offering suggestions, oftentimes they're not listened to as much as like a disability service professional, right?
Right.
Someone who gets to be an expert about us, or about accommodation in some way.
Mm-hmm.
And it is like you've gone through all of this work, and what do you get? Slightly longer on a test, right? it's
Yeah.
it's like the state, like what we get is, oh, we can have equal, like, oh, the classroom will be someplace that I can physically get to, right? That's the
Mm-hmm.
accommodation, and they make you go through this giant process for it. It just speaks to the ways in which disabled people, I mean, this is ableism more generally, are constantly undermined.
Mm-hmm.
Like they're always looking for a non-disabled expert about us. It can even be a caretaker, right? It's
Yeah.
not uncommon if you use a wheelchair for whoever is standing next to you to be asked questions about what you might want when you're right
Mm.
there.
Right.
Right, it's just like, oh, disabled person, someone else probably knows better, right? The sort of default social expectation there is all wacky.
Mm-hmm.
And the sort of deference to whoever looks non-disabled around you. And of course we usually travel in packs, so it doesn't mean that they're non-disabled, right?
Mm-hmm.
It means that the seeing an apparent disability like makes people turn away in a particular way. And that's true, you know, in workplace, in school, in public life. I mean, to show up to some sorts of like public meetings, if you need an accommodation, you have to ask for it 10 to 14 days ahead of time, because we all
Mm-hmm.
know what we're doing 10 to 14 days ahead of time. And we know what will be well enough to attend 10 to 14 days ahead of time, so that they can, get captioning or get an interpreter or move the whole space to some place that is, barrier free, or
Mm-hmm.
more accessible in terms of infrastructure. um it So many things are just built in ways that require extra work of disabled people, and
Mm-hmm.
we don't necessarily have more time, and often we have more fatigue. It's like the
Yeah.
whole structure of so many things in our lives. So it's not just technoableism, but ableism more generally, that sort of controls um so much of what we can do and when we're believed even.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, that point about like being believed or not being believed, right? And for me, I always think about our expertise as, expertise in ourselves, right? We don't need someone else to be an expert in our lived experience, but often it's seen as less valid. We need someone else to say it for us, particularly, if you're a part of any sort of marginalized or quote unquote not normal group, then we're always looking for that external expert, quote unquote. When you're talking about students, I was really thinking about the whole accommodations piece, right? Again, because I'm in the classroom, and who has the ability or the means to have the doctor who can fill out the paperwork, who believes them, who can then get it routed, through the university system, which is not very streamlined at times. And then the type of accommodations, which when I think about it, aren't those just things that we should be offering all students anyway? I don't think there should be a special accommodation for a lot of those things. It should just be the way we're interacting with our students, and the way we're setting up our classrooms. And I think that speaks to, again, ableism and how it is threaded throughout our society. And so things that really should just be part of our practice are now, they have to be accommodations.
Yeah, I think about it. So this is sometimes called like universal design for learning. Like you're going to go
Mhm.
ahead and build it in a way that more people can partake, with or without accommodations, that it's already set up in a disability forward way. And I set up my class this way. It means like I have to do, like I get the list of accommodations, and it's like, oh, most of these don't apply because it's already set up. Like I share all my
Mhm.
notes. They're in the Google Drive for our class. Enjoy your notes.
Yeah.
Right. This is, it's not super hard to do a lot of these things if you build them in first, right? I think
Mhm.
about like how I'm going to structure assignments in ways that, can adequately test things, but also, not require us to have to go through a whole bunch of accommodations processes, because so many people are, you know, like not going to get the accommodations they actually need and deserve,
Mm-hmm.
and are their legal right, just because of how we've rigged the system against disabled people in so many ways. I think about this also. So I have a chapter in this book on neurodiversity,
Mm-hmm.
and I think about like how do you properly, I end up quoting like a lot of autistic people and people with ADHD in the chapter, just because those aren't my experiences.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to be able to talk and to learn within community, and I thought it was really important to address that piece of it as someone who is neurodivergent, because I have chemo brain, and so time works a little differently for me, and I always pay attention to what people with ADHD are like. What are they doing? And then
Mm-hmm.
I try to just copy that, as someone with chemo brain, like, oh, all like, thank you, Liz Spingola, she's the reason I have all these alarms on my phone. I was explaining when I showed up to a meeting late, and she was like, oh no, here, give me your phone.
Mm-hmm.
You could, I'm going to set an alarm. You're going to be fine. This is, these are things we share in community about adapting. I was a
Mm-hmm.
couple years in by the time Liz showed me this life hack. So I learn from people in sort of the neurodiversity movement, every day, to exchange information that
Mm-hmm.
helps for a wide variety of things. It's not that we have to be, and I think this is also where like technological approaches fail us. We don't all have to have the same disability to use the same stuff. Some
Mm-hmm.
people think, oh, I know what your disability is. Here's what your accommodations are. That's not how the accommodations process should be at all, because it's not that all disabilities affect us in the same way, right? I
Mm-hmm.
know lots of amputees, the things we might have issues with are kind of different, right? Some people have significant issues with like phantom pain, and that is incredibly debilitating. Some people are like prosthetic fit, some people are, maintenance issues. Some of them, like, it's not that we're all even struggling, right?
Mm-hmm.
We might be good, and have knowledge to help other people be good too. There's just there's a lot of joy for me in cross disability work,
Mm-hmm.
because of that sort of inventive learning. Oh, that worked for you, let me try that. And it's not, and it doesn't have to be someone with the same disability you have. As you know People
Mm-hmm.
could reframe ways of thinking about things and adapting. It can be really useful, and just like little tweaks, that don't necessarily, they're not life changing in the way that technologies are advertised to be, but they are more often, right? It was life
Mm-hmm.
changing to start setting all of these alarms. I'm not late. I show up to my classes. I'm not constantly worried that I'm going to be late all the time. And that is, sort of in your mental task list, really important. So I talk a little bit about the history of autism specifically, because I
Mm-hmm.
think, even outside the realm of physical disability, we see lots of news about disability, but autism makes the news a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And especially like different types of therapy for autism are like really focused on normalization and
Mm-hmm.
not on making autistic people more comfortable in their bodies and in the world. And I think that's a real shame. And that's technoableism at work too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really appreciated that chapter, and very heartbreaking too at times, because I'm not very familiar with autism and some of the practices that are used to make autistic folks quote unquote normal. And so I think it's really important for folks to read that and to understand what's happening, in ways that we can be more inclusive to folks and not have these demands on what is quote unquote normal, right? But allow people to be in their bodies and express themselves. So I thought that was really important. Um, Ashely, it's been such a pleasure to chat with you today. Thank you so much for writing this book. Like you said, a roadmap for folks. And it's definitely been a roadmap for me and something that I'm going to recommend to folks to read, because I think it's just so important and written in a way where easy to understand and where you can pick it up or pick up a chapter here and there, and learn alongside you. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on the program. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you again to Dr. Ashly Shew. Her book is Against Technoableism, Rethinking Who Needs Improvement. I cannot tell you how excited I was to see this book. I know that people have a lot of questions about ability, about disability, about how we can show up in this world and understand the world that we live in better and the folks around us better, but also thinking about our own experiences with disability as well. And so I think this book does such an amazing job of really challenging maybe some of the beliefs or biases that we have, but also, as Ashley mentioned, being a roadmap for disability that we might personally experience at some point in our lives as well. So it was such a pleasure to talk to Ashley today. I just want to close with this reminder. Each and every day, you get to decide. Yes, you get to decide what type of day it's going to be and how you're going to show up in this world. Over time, it's those daily choices that create your life. What type of life are you creating? Well, I hope that you're creating the type of life where you will join me again next week here on Let's Grab Coffee on WYXR. And remember, subscribe to Let's Grab Coffee in podcast format so you never miss a conversation. And also, it makes it super easy for you to share this conversation with a friend. I know that you learned so much today. I mean, I did. And maybe there's a piece of our conversation today that you want to re-listen to or that you think might be helpful to someone that you know. So be sure to share this conversation with someone and tell them to join us back here next week on WYXR. This is Let's Grab Coffee, and I'm Sanaa.